This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
I'm Travis Taylor, a political scientist by training with my doctorate from the University of Kentucky and a public opinion researcher by day. I'm joined today on this episode by Dr. Michael Cohen, the author of Modern Political Campaigns: How Professionalism, Speed, and Technology Have Revolutionized Elections, which was just released on April 1st. In it, Dr. Cohen, with a professor's approach, lays out much of the knowledge one needs to manage today's political campaigns and an insider's view of how to break into a career in political consulting. Dr. Cohen is the CEO of Cohen Research Group, a political, public affairs, and corporate research firm. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of Florida and cut his teeth in practical politics there in the Sunshine State. He publishes the award-winning Congress in Your Pocket suite of mobile apps and teaches college courses on political campaigns, research methods, digital strategy, and public policy in Washington, D.C. In addition to leading a polling and market research company, Dr. Cohen teaches at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center in Washington. Before that, he taught at the University of California's Washington Center and was the director of my alma mater, the Graduate School of Political Management at the George Washington University. Dr. Cohen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this was a great book. I really enjoyed getting to read this second edition and look at the contrast between it and the first. But before we jump into that, I always like to start with letting the listeners kind of get a taste of who you are, get to know you a little bit. So I read some of your bio, but tell us more about yourself. What was your path to political science?
So growing up, this was sort of a thing where I latched onto politics pretty early as a kid, which was, weird, because that's, I like sports and I liked other things, but politics was really something very interesting to me. I kind of learned it at the dinner table. We used to watch the evening news every night and then discuss the issues at the table, which I thought was an interesting way to sort of like hone your ideas on what you thought. Went to University of Maryland. That was a choice because I wanted to make sure that I wanted to be close to Washington. Started there for a year, but my parents did the Jewish migration from New York to Florida. And so I transferred to the University of Florida, where I got my undergraduate, master's, and PhD. But importantly, beyond all the academic parts, really understood and started getting involved in politics on campus. And so I was an elected senator. I was, an officer in my fraternity. I was an officer in the Interfraternity Council. I ran the graduate school Students Association. And so there was a lot of things I was sort of really involved with on campus, and all my friends were involved. And, we really kind of learned how to do politics by doing it on campus. And so what I found going into my career which was actually somewhat surprising, that a lot of the lessons that we learned on campus really were portable elsewhere, because a lot of the same people were moving on from, campus politics to actually, adult politics. And so a lot of the same things that you sort of view of people, that person's kind of in it for themselves. Oh, that person's really interested in policy. This person is sort of someone you want to watch on the way up. A lot of those things that you sort of saw were sort of archetypes, as a college student. You saw them now. And so we can speak to each other in shorthand about, oh, well, that person's this person, that person's that person. The recognition that you have in politics in the real world is actually much more attuned because we were involved on campus. And I've heard a lot about this, throughout my career, people being involved on campus and taking those lessons out into the real world. And then, of course, toward the end of my PhD, I ran political campaigns for Republican Party of Florida. A fraternity brother of mine was actually running for Florida House. And I also had two other candidates. And as it turns out, the one that lost was actually my friend. And the ones that won, one was a guy named Mike Fasano, who was beloved in the area in Florida, sort of the St. Pete area. And he was just this terrific, really down-to-earth human being that everybody loved. And then I had another candidate named Nancy Argenziano, who was really tough. And there's some really fun stories about that in the book. But I was the one who was actually cheerleading her because I really felt like, she really fired people up. And she was running a tough race against an incumbent. And so that's why the party initially didn't want to give money to it. But over time, it was pretty clear that she was inching forward. And I eventually talked them into supporting her. And then there's this great flashpoint in the book where we're running against Helen Spivey, who's the manatee lady, and our candidate is the barracuda. And she was really tough on water rights, which is a big thing in Florida. And there was these ads that were dropped by the NRSC of all things because they had so much money. And she heard them and she was hearing it from people. And they said that they were terrible and they were mean and this and that. And it was this funny ad where they were channeling the Addams family. And it was, her name was Helen Spivey. She's raising all your taxes, less money for your family. She's Helen Spivey. Da 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 da. Da, 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 da. And it was running like every 10 minutes on all the radio stations. My candidate was really pissed and she threatened to kill me if I didn't get them taken down. And so I called Frank Turfirm at the party and I said, please tell me you've got something for me. He goes, okay, let me check. And they did some testing on it and they did some ads, and Terrence Group did some terrific polling on it. And he came back to me and said, look, if you could just keep your candidate from killing you, we're going to win. And I said, okay. Point taken, boss. I'm gonna go call. And so at this point, like, the candidate wasn't even talking to me anymore. She was so mad because she basically blamed the whole thing on me, as if like I had any choice in the matter. I was like this low-paid functional, dude from like the party. And so I get on the phone and I'm like, hey, I speak to Nancy, and it was this boyfriend who was her campaign manager. He goes, yeah, she's really mad at you. I said, well, please tell her that we're actually going to win. And I get her on the phone finally. He's just like, fine, I'll let you talk to her. And she starts laying into me, this bleeping ad and that bleeping ad, and you're going to I'm going to kill you and do this, that. I said, well, okay, first of all, point taken, you can absolutely kill me even without a weapon. I got it. But you shouldn't, because we're going to win. And here's why. And it was the first time in my career where like polling actually saved my life. And yeah, so it was great. And like we ended up winning. And so I ended up being on the phone with Hernando County in one year, and then the candidate in the other. I'm like, okay, we won. Cool. Hey, guess what? We won. And she's like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Do you want to work for me in Tallahassee? I'm like, no, just a couple of weeks ago, you tried to kill me. I'm like, thank you. And I got off the phone with her. I call Frank Turfirma and I get him on the phone. And he goes, can you repeat what you just told me? Because I told him we won. And so I told him, and all of a sudden there's this roar in the background, like actual cheers. He had put me on speaker. And what happened was Nancy was the one who tipped the balance of the Florida House for the first time since Reconstruction. Like, we had no idea like how important the race was, and we won. And like, so like it really like launched my career. I came to DC and started out at the Gallup poll, spent a number of years there, and then worked for Tony Fabrizio after that as his vice president of public affairs, and then opened up my own firm with his approval and his support. What some people really don't understand sometimes is like some of these people are really wonderful people to be around. And Tony was really supportive in me opening up my own shop. And then over time, I found my way back to academia teaching, and I found my way to the book, which was the first edition was 17 years in the making. And the second edition was 4 years, which was nice. I got it done a little quicker.
Yeah, I'm actually really enjoyed that story when you shared it with me a few weeks ago, and then when I read it in the book. And I want to circle back to the story about how the book came to be. But you talked about your path through college politics and into adult politics. And while your fraternity brothers were out running for Senate, or state Senate and state House, and a lot of them probably going to law school, I'm curious why you went the PhD route.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think when I was in my mid-20s, I had finished up my undergraduate degree. I finished up my master's. I went straight through, so it was pretty quick. But I always said to myself, I'm like, well, what's the end game here? Like, what do I actually really want to do? And there were three things. I remember this conversation I had with my father one time at lunch. And he said to me, well, what do you want to do? Like he wasn't in politics, so he didn't really understand like what I was trying to accomplish. And it really forced me to think about it. And I said, well, I actually think there were three things. I think I want to work in politics. I want to write, and I want to teach. And I think that those things all come together in a PhD. Okay. Because I had gone from being a political science major to being basically a comms major as an undergrad. And then as a master's student, putting together a proto version of what people call now political communication. Like there wasn't a program like that when I was going through my college master's program, but I had a conversation with the political science department and I had a conversation with the communications department. I said, hey, look, this is what I really want to do. I want to work in political comms. I had to explain to them what political comms was. And then they said, oh, well, what we could do is, for your master's thesis, you can do something that's political and also communications related. We'll have somebody from the political science department, work with you, and you can always work with us. And I was like, okay, that's cool. And then I really felt like, well, if I'm going to go teach someday full time, having the PhD is really the credential. And since I was already there, I decided, okay, well, if I stayed at Florida as opposed to going somewhere else, which is what I was being encouraged to do, because there's all this weird academia reasons that they want you to go and get just different mind, sets from other universities. And I was like, I get it, but, I'm paying for this. And so, if I stay, I could be done with my PhD in 2.5 years. If I go somewhere else, I wouldn't be able to take some of those credits from my master's to my PhD. And I said, well, just stay. I have friends here. I have a political network here. I like it here. Why not just plow through? And so, at 26, I finished my PhD, and my dissertation chair, Dr. Craig, who's no longer at the program, said to me, well, don't you want to stay and like publish this? I'm like, no, actually, like it's 1996 and I want to go to work. Like there's a cycle going on. Like I'm in. And he looked at me like I was an alien. And he's like, well, why do the PhD? I'm like, don't worry about it, buddy. Like just walk with me on the day where I have to get the cap and the gown and smile for the cameras. Like, can we just do this? And I remember him telling me, he goes, well, your dissertation is basically an A idea with a C execution. I'm like, does that graduate? he's like, yeah. But he strung it out for as much as he could. And so like, as I was on the campaign trail, like I was actually doing revisions, by email back and forth with him, and he finally approved it. And I was like, good, grumpy guy is done. And I could just graduate and move on with my life. So my point of view on the whole thing is that the PhD really brought together, because I got the PhD in political science and I got the undergraduate master's essentially in mass comm, that the PhD in political science sort of rounded out what I wanted to do. But it also placed me at a disadvantage. So like when I came to DC, I would be interviewing on the Hill and they're like, what are you doing here? Like you have a PhD, like you want to work as an assistant press secretary? Like what are you doing? And so like I didn't have any really good advice to give to take from people because nobody was helping me. And then Gallup came through, which was perfect because they're like, PhD, we like you. That's awesome. Come work with us. And I had like applied there on a lark because I said that at the end of the campaign, I'm like, I need a job. I mean, and I want to go to DC. All right, well, Gallup is hiring. Yay. That'd be great. Like polling saved my life. I might as well just go ahead and work there. And so, so Gallup was great to start off because you get this, really, open views on things and you get to do a lot of different kind of work. And it was a great place to start. But for me, I think the PhD more than anything else sort of rounded out the academic story for me and later on, when I wanted to go and teach, it was very much a no-brainer for people to hire me because I had the doctorate. And then when I wanted to work a little bit full time, again, I had the credential that academia respects. And so I think that was really helpful. But as far as, being 26 with a PhD, it was weird. Like people were like, how did you do that? Like what is with you? Like, and why would I hire you? That's weird. Like you're 26 and have a PhD. Like why, who does that? Like usually you go to work or it takes a while. And it's like, well, I was really motivated to go work. I was paying for it.
Right, exactly. All right. So thank you, Dr. Cohen, for sharing your background and kind of where you came from and what brought you to the book. And so I mentioned it a few minutes ago. You shared a story with me about the genesis story of this book. And I found it really inspiring. And I was, when I invited you to do the show, I was hoping that you would be as open about that story as you were with me, with our reader or with our listeners rather. And then I saw that you wrote the story in the book as well. And so tell us the story about how the first edition of this book came about.
So it came at a time in my life where I thought I had a lot going on. So I had just left Tony Fabrizio's firm and I was, putting together my own and trying to figure out what that would be. And so that was going on. I also had a very young child, who's precocious and high energy. And then we also had one on the way. We had my son on the way. And we were moving from Maryland to Virginia for a number of reasons. But, we got a house. And so there was a lot of pressure. My wife was at home. My daughter, we had a young kid. We had one on the way. I was starting my own firm. And I had this, I saw that a friend of mine, David Mark, had published his book. And I was really excited for him. And so I took him out to lunch and I said to him, that's really great, man. We had this really fun conversation. We both kind of came up in DC around the same time. And he said to me, would you ever consider writing a book? And I said, well, sure. That's what PhDs do, I guess. I guess I should probably write one. He goes, well, do you have an idea for one? And I literally kind of just pulled it out of my ass. And I was like, oh, yeah, I want to write something about the permanent campaign, and all the rise of consulting and stuff like that. And he goes, well, how about I introduce you to my publisher? And I'm like, oh, this is nice. I take him out to lunch and he's patting me on the head by introducing me to his publisher. I'm like, okay, I get it. This is great. So I played along and I was like, yeah, oh, sure, that'd be great. Yeah. Okay, cool. So he introduces the two of us and we go to lunch locally. And again, I'm thinking, everyone is just being really nice to me. I don't know why. Maybe because I'm nice. Maybe people are being nice back. The universe is being nice to me. And we had this interesting conversation about the book and about the idea for the book. And he says to me, why don't you give me a proposal? I'm like, okay, great. Again, I'm being patted on the head once again. And so I go home. I spent a half an hour on it because I'm like, okay, there's no way this is going to happen. I'm not ready to do this. I'm too busy. And so I fire it off to him. And a week later, he basically writes back and he goes, yeah, let's do it. I was like, oh, shit. I'm like, uh-oh. Like, what did I just do? I'm running around in circles like a dog, trying to catch its tail. And then I do. And I'm like, oh, God, all right, I guess I have to write this thing. And then I start back ending into reasons why to write the book. I'm like, well, it'll be good for my career. It'll be good for the firm. It'll be good to, proto thought leadership is probably a good thing for the book. Yeah. Okay. Good for my career, whatever. Okay, fine. Sometimes you can't choose when the good things happen to you. You have to embrace them. And so at that time, a friend of mine, Chris Tompkins, who was in my wedding, who's a really, really close friend and a person who we came up campus politics together. He actually served as president of the student body with my roommate, Brian Seminas, who was treasurer. And so I was the graduate school council president at the time. And the three of us were, real close, as well as other guys in that group. And Chris had asked me to run his campaign. And I said, well, and this is months before the whole book thing. And I said, well, I can't do that. I don't have time. And also, like, you're crazy. Like, I can't work with crazy. Like, you show up late, you're not linear. Like, you'd be a really tough candidate for me to work with. And I want to continue loving you as a friend. So the answer is no, but I'll do your website. And so I did his website for him pro bono. And in the middle of the campaign, he starts getting sick. and starts getting run down, starts losing weight, which is what's not like him. He's a big guy. And he then is hospitalized, and we find out that he has cancer. And we find out that he not just has cancer, but that he's not going to make it. And this is over several months. And so it was really hard. I mean, I was trying to put everything together in my life, and then all of a sudden, this big keystone portion of it was falling apart. And I finally found a way to get down there. I was working on a project, and I was able to go over and see him. And he was in the hospital, and he was dying, and he didn't look like himself anymore. And it was really, really hard. And I said goodbye to him. I told him I loved him. And I talked to his mom and stuff like that. We were all pretty close. And he didn't make it. And, we went to the funeral. It was terrible. I broke down. I've never broken down since. I really, really it hit so hard. And I didn't sleep for 2 years after that. And then I just, I kind of like poured myself into the work that I felt like I could control, which was my business and, being there for my wife and kids and, just doing as much as I can, basically working on no sleep. And I made the mistake, although it was, I don't know, I guess ultimately the right thing to do, of saying that I was going to dedicate it to him and that I was going to donate a portion of the proceeds to the university in his name. And so whenever I would open up the Word document to write, like it was the first page, dedicated to Chris Tompkins, and I got blocked up. I couldn't even write it. And so, it was, with grief, I mean, it works on its own timetable. And, I probably should have seen someone about it, but I didn't because, I was just this young gun with a PhD with a wife and 2 kids and responsibilities and, all those kinds of things. And I had this book and it was the thing that fell apart. And so every year for the next 17 years, I would get a statement from Rowan and Littlefield Publishing, $0, 0 cents, the permanent campaign. And I was like, yeah, I know. I still haven't written this thing. And I'm the guy who gets everything done. Like I'm the guy who, if there's a checklist, it gets done. It always gets done on time, if not before. I just don't let anyone down. And in this case, like this was a thing that I let myself down. And I to a certain extent, I felt like I was letting Chris down. Fast forward to COVID, we're all locked down. And all of a sudden we all have all this time. I get fired from WPAI because they lost a bunch of clients and they were all locked down. And also Chris Wilson's a terrible human being. He just fired me in the middle of COVID. But so I now have like all the time in the world and literally nothing to do, right? My kids are older. We have money in the bank, so I'm not really concerned, about getting a job right away. And I turned back to the book. And I had gone to APEC a few months before COVID locked down. And a good friend of mine, Terry Troy, said to me, well, what's going on with your book? Because like he had just published his book, Fight House, which by the way is terrific. It's about staffers in the White House, and he was a staffer. It's a great book. So I said to him, well, I'm stuck and I'm trying to figure this out. And we talked it through and he said, well, what have you been teaching? And I said, I was teaching this course named Modern Political Campaigns that I had come up with for UCDC, University of California DC program. And he goes, well, you already have the book, Mike. You just haven't written it yet. And I said, wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way. He's like, try and write that book. That's the book you know. It's like, you've been teaching that class for years. Like, it's in your head. Like, it'd probably come right out of you. I went back. Sure enough, 8 weeks later, the book's done. And I couldn't believe it. Like, I couldn't believe it. It just completely unlocked it. Number one, I had all the time in the world. Number two, it was 17 years since Chris had died. And number three, Terry Troy said to me, hey, look, it's already there. Like, you just need to pull it out of your head. And so I did. And I did the one thing that I didn't do previously, which was I was hypercritical about everything that I wrote. And I committed to just hitting the word count. And the word count was at that point 50,000. I had actually read it wrong. And so I went to 60. And then when I finished, I was trying to figure out like who to call, because like it's 17 years later, like who's around anymore to like give this to. As it turns out, John Sisk was just wrapping up pretty much the back end of his career, but he was still there. And so I caught him at Roman and I said, hey, I got the book, but it's not the book that I pitched you 17 years ago, but it's actually done. And if you want it, cool. If not, I'll hit send to Kindle and just be done with it and like check this thing off my to-do list for my life. And he said, no, I'll read it. And I sent it to him. And again, this is the third time I'm thinking somebody's patting me on the head. 2 weeks later, he comes back and he says, this is good. We're going to publish it. I'm like, wait. You're going to publish it and this is good? Oh my God, this is crazy. And so they published the book, and it ended up being a book that had its own lifespan beyond what I thought it would be. And to the point where it did so well that when I said to them, hey, I think we should probably do an update because of, AI and all the advances that have gone on and kind of and as well as a lot of things that happened in the past 4 years, with influencers and podcasts and everything else, it was really time to do an update. And he said, yeah, no, we're in, are you good with it? The unspoken was, are you going to take another 17 years to write this one? And I'm like, no, this is good. I'm through it, And then this book is actually dedicated to my wife, Lisa, because usually what happens with authors, you dedicate to your wife first, but because of the Chris Tompkins thing, she understood it. So this time I absolutely went all in and made sure that she was, well featured in the front and the back ends of the book. And the people who did the index were really great because they actually put her in the index. So Lisa did the Washington read and flipped to the back and saw her name and she freaked out. It was really cool. And this book had all the enjoyment of writing and 100% less of the angst. The team was terrific this time. John Sisk handed it off to Michael Kearns, Anna Eggers, and just a bunch of other people have been really wonderful to work with. And this time around, I just feel really good about where this is and what the book says. And I think it's a good addition to the whole genre of, political campaign books.
Take me out to the ball game.
What are you doing?
Did you know DirecTV has the most MLB games?
So you're singing.
Yeah, they put your favorite teams front and center right when you turn it on. Buy me some cold cuts and flabberjacks.
Those aren't even the words.
I'm allergic to peanuts.
Stream DirecTV, home of the most MLB games. Visit DirecTV.com. Claim based on total games offered on sports networks. Availability varies by zip code and package. New customers. Service renews monthly unless you cancel. Choice package required. Restrictions apply.
Hi, this is Javon, your Blinds.com design consultant.
Oh, wow. A real person.
Yep. I'm here to help with everything from selecting the perfect window treatments to...
Well, I've got a complicated project.
No problem. I can even help schedule a professional measure and install. We can also send you samples fast and free.
I just might have to do more.
Whatever you need.
So the first room we're looking at is for...
Shop Blinds.com now and save up to 40% site-wide. Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Yeah, well, because my background is also in practical politics with a path through the PhD, I enjoyed reading this book a lot. And within that genre of political campaigns, where does this book fit? What's it about? What's the premise of this book?
That's a fair question. Yeah. I mean, it basically is, the book is really about how would you talk to somebody who knows nothing about political campaigns and bring them along as to how these things are built, what the issues are within them, and really how it works. Like, the best book of all time in politics, in my opinion, is What It Takes, because it takes you inside the campaigns of everyone running for president of the United States in 1988. And it is a very sensitive, interesting, human look at what it takes to run for president of the United States. And I think that really imprinted on me, because when I looked at my book, I said, you know what? I want to write a book that not only takes you through the nuts and bolts, but also has some humanity in it. And so there are stories from my career and from other careers about really what it takes to work on a campaign. So what it takes is really about what it takes to run and how to be a candidate. Like, this book is really about what it takes to work on a campaign. What are the various things that campaigns actually do? How are they organized? What technologies do they use? What types of people work on the campaigns? And so the kinds of things where, like, if you're just a voter who engages every 2 to 4 years, all you see is the product of all these campaigns. You don't really know what goes on inside of them. At the very best, sometimes you get stories in the New York Times or the Washington Post or others or Politico about the infighting, that goes on campaigns. But it doesn't really give you a good feel for why are decisions being made this way? What are the technologies that are going on? From my perspective, I put it into the rubric of, how technology, speed, and professionalism, have revolutionized elections. And I think that there's a story to be told that I think I told relatively well about how the industry became more professional instead of just being sort of political cogs, how technology changed everything, and how the speed of campaigns now is such that it basically pushes everything 24/7. And even though there were always 24/7 news cycles over the past 30 years, with the internet, with social media, with other technologies, with texts, with all the instant communication that we have right now, it really is the thing that has amplified all the decision making you have to make and all the pre-work you have to do to make sure that when you are in a situation that you recognize it quickly, that you are able to punch back or you're able to take the advantage when you can see it. And so a lot of these things are sort of in those three buckets of what I call professionalism, technology, and speed. And it really has revolutionized elections to the point where instead of looking at big groups of voters, where you're looking at even, black, white, male, female, whatever, or even different parts of the country, we've now gotten to the point where instead of just looking at smaller segments like soccer moms, I've worked with Mark Penn and he came up with that term. I'm probably the only person who ever worked for Mark Penn and also for Tony Fabrizio. But I think what we are right now is we are devolving down into getting messages out to individuals, to much smaller pockets of people, because we can now target them on social media, on streaming, on connected TV in a lot of different ways. And to me, that's super interesting because now what you're doing is you're empowering voters a lot more and you're communicating with them directly, as opposed to thinking about them as big groups of people that you just hope you can move. And it also has become much more efficient for campaigns to run because instead of spending gobs of money on television, which is going out to everybody, you can hyper target things to individuals, where they are on streaming or, pre-roll ads on YouTube or wherever they are on text and, other sources. And so I think campaigns have become much more personal, and it's really opened up for campaigns the opportunity to go at the middle because now it is actually cost efficient to go at those voters as opposed to just defaulting to, I'm going to get all the people on my side and you're going to get all the people on your side, and we're just going to hope it works out in the middle.
So thinking about the audience for that type of for the book that you've written, for the purpose that you've written it, it's clear to me that voters who want kind of the inside scoop would be a perfect audience for this. Somebody who, like you said, engages every 2 to 4 years, but doesn't really know much more, but wants to. A second audience for this book, having read it, is aspiring campaign managers. People who want to go out and run campaigns. Why should academics, the primary listeners of this podcast, those political science professors, why should they read this book and engage with it?
Yeah, I think it grounds all the work that you're doing in the classroom. So for example, if you're doing a lot of theoretical stuff in your classroom, what this does is it brings it all home for students. When I look at this book, I think that there's essentially two groups, right? There's sort of the people who are really interested in politics, who want to understand the process. And then there are people on the professional side who, for example, let's say you're doing political science and you're pre-law marginally, because that's essentially the path, right? And people are always telling you, oh yeah, you'll be a good lawyer. You're going to political science, you like to argue or whatever. And, that's usually the precocious, political science student who, wants to think the big thought, but also make arguments. Well, there's another path for political scientists. The professional path for political scientists is working in politics. It's not just going to law school. Political science became the default for pre-law because there is no pre-law on most campuses. So we lose some of our best and brightest to law school, and they go there and they find it wanting. And so for me, I thought that there should be a text, number one, that I could use in my classroom, because I always teach from a very professional standpoint, but also to students to say to them, hey, you know what? There's something else you can do with your life. You can get involved in politics. And oh, by the way, you can actually work in the business of politics because there is a business in politics. And then when you look at the book, you can then see yourself in 12 different chapters. So 12 different jobs. And so we're looking at people who are, in communications or in political science or in history or in a lot of other sort of places and saying to them, hey, look, there's an opportunity for you here to do the thing that you're really interested in at a professional level. And this is how you do it. And here's some stories about not only how it works, but also the people that have done it successfully. And I think that is an eye-opening experience for a lot of people who have read the book at the undergraduate level or even master's and PhD level, because they said to me, well, this is the only book that I've read that actually teaches me about how this works. And it gives me an opportunity to think about, wow, I could see myself in the opposition research chapter or the comms chapter. I could see myself as a campaign manager or a pollster or someone who would write ads, and instead of like working for, commercial clients like McDonald's, I could actually go and, help democracy or something like that, or push, the kinds of issues that I really care about. And I think to a real extent, to me, that's really exciting. And that is the feedback that I keep getting from students who are reaching out to me. Even this week, I got one from the University of Florida. I did a guest lecture there a couple of weeks ago. And she said to me, this is the only book that I've seen, that has talked to me like I could be a professional in this. And to me, like part of education at the collegiate level is not just giving people a lot of ways to think, right? And so you throw a lot of theoretical constructs at them. You help them think through a lot of different issues, but also to think about what you want to do with your life. And I feel like universities are not really set up right now to help them make that move, because the professors who are writing are thinking more along the lines of like, well, how do I teach people to think, as opposed to how I teach them to do? And so because I have a career that spans not only academics, which is 13 years in right now, but also doing it, I think I'm one of those unique people who could do that. And so I felt like that was the voice that came out of me, which was better than just a book on the permanent campaign, which would have been very academic. This is much more attuned to actually who I am, which is why I think it was easier to write the second time when I went at it and finished it in 8 weeks. And then the second edition came out of me very quickly too, because I'm very passionate about helping people get their first jobs and help them along the way. And because I found that very difficult when I came to Washington. There wasn't an infrastructure around to help me. And so I try to build that infrastructure through my network, whether it's on LinkedIn or offline or with my students or the alumni who have gone through programs where I've taught. And I think that it's something that I feel very, very strongly about, that there needs to be more texts like Modern Political Campaigns. Like this shouldn't be a unique piece of the literature. It should be maybe the leading edge of it.
Okay. And we've talked a lot about this being the second edition that recently came out. The first one came out 4 years ago. But the second edition has 2 chapters that are new, right? The artificial intelligence chapter and what was originally supposed to be the first whole book, right? The permanent campaign. So I want to dive into those 2 topics a little bit to wrap up the show. I'm starting with artificial intelligence. This is the biggest kind of new chapter in the book. Tell the listeners a little bit about that chapter.
So to me, when I was looking at doing a second edition, I said, well, the only reason to do it is if there's something new. Now, as it turns out, political cycles are very, very consistent, right? We all know 2, 4, 6 years, whatever. But usually within the span of a 4-year period, there's usually some hot new technology that comes through. And so if you look back, you could look at micro-targeting, you could look at the internet, fundraising, you could look at social media. This is a new wave of technology that is not just affecting, everyone in their personal lives and their professional lives, but it's also affecting politics. And so the challenge for me is not looking at it from the prism of, well, let's talk about the disinformation from AI, because there was a lot of people who were writing about that. Sasha Eisenberg did a really good book on that, and there was a lot of other interesting literature about it. But I felt like that was playing itself out in real time. Like I was bored with it almost immediately, because there's always someone when a new technology comes out in politics, there's always the doomers right away who said this is going to kill us all or destroy democracy. And then there's always the people who are overly enthusiastic, who are like ready to mortgage their house just to start a new startup, and this is going to save democracy. It's going to make us all connected and we're all going to be nice to each other. And I kind of felt like, well, my book is all about like, well, how are we actually using this? And so I went out and talked to a lot of people in the field. And also I did my own research. And I actually used AI for Congress in Your Pocket. We now actually summarize congressional bills on your phone now, which is really super cool. So I was like sort of embedded in this in a way that I think most people weren't. So I was working in it and I was teaching it and I was also writing about it. And so I learned as I was talking to people who are real pros that the smaller campaigns, the ones that are down ballot, were actually getting the most use out of AI compared to the larger campaigns. And the reason why is because, number one, this is the first time in political history that I could figure out, maybe someone has a better answer to this than I do, but this is the first technology that political campaigns adopted that everybody had at the same time. Usually what happens is something happens, the television ads, or they're all extremely expensive to begin with. And then it becomes cheaper as you get down the development wheel because, we get scale and you get efficiencies and all those kinds of things. And so eventually like down ballot gets there, particularly with analytics and stuff like that. But usually it's really hard to sort of latch on to a new technology because you just don't have the money. Well, ChatGPT was free. And then if you wanted to pay anything, it was $20. If you guys were real fancy, you had $200 to throw around, right? And then all of a sudden you get all the toys that everybody got. So it didn't matter if you were running for president or if you were running for dog catcher, you had this tool. So the question was, oh my God, now everyone is using the tool at the same time, which means everyone's experimenting, everyone's making mistakes, everyone's figuring out their best practices as they go through. So instead of the top campaigns defining the roles for the next 2 and 4 and 6 years with AI, all the campaigns were figuring it out at the same time, and they were taking different things from it. So for example, the larger campaigns tried to use video and some, and photography, and found that when they did that, there was a huge backlash. So you think about like the Biden ad where there was a robocall with his fake voice, like that dude went to jail. Okay. And then Ron DeSantis uses a few different posts on social media from Donald Trump to actually do a fake voiceover, and he gets shelled for it. And the GOP tries to go ahead and use Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and their faces look weird on the screen and they get pilloried for it. So basically what happens is like they touch the stove, they take their hand off really quick and they're like, okay, screw this. We don't need this. This is the stuff we don't need in our campaigns. Let's just run campaigns, right? But the smaller campaigns saying, okay, I see what's going on there. So that's not really a good move. But if you have, for example, me, in 1996, like I'm like the staffer. Right? I don't have a staff. I'm like the staff for 3 campaigns.
You're the grassroots director, the fundraiser, the
everything guy, the everything, knocking on doors, right? And so now instead of just me, I now have the ability to ask ChatGPT for help. So when Nancy's yelling at me about the ad, I can go, how can I make Nancy not kill me? I get a little bit of help, right, on the campaign. Or if I'm trying to write a speech, or if I'm trying to write content, or if I'm trying to write a mail piece or whatever, like all of these things now, you now have the ability to ask a relatively informed observer for some help. And so for smaller campaigns, they got basically a much better drafting board and a much better younger staffer than they had in the beginning. But as they found out, as they were using the tools, you get back sort of like boring stuff. Like it's all well written, it's coherent, it's responsive to your prompts, but it goes to the point where you say, okay, I need adult supervision on this thing. Like it doesn't have the right political context. It doesn't understand the candidates. It doesn't understand what's going on in the ether. It doesn't understand what would work and what wouldn't. It doesn't understand, opposition research. And so what you do is you get these things from ChatGPT, even if you load it up correctly with all the previous speeches and content, even if you give it really good prompts, and we talk about how to do that in the book. But at the end of it, when you get it, you then need to add the humanity to it that is usually missing from ChatGPT. Why? Because it's not tuned for humanity. It's tuned for information. And so you get it, and then what it does is it spurs interesting conversations between the person who is editing this and then presents it either to a campaign manager or the candidate. And then you have a much higher level human conversation about the content, as opposed to, oh, you know what? This is totally incoherent. It has a ton of typos. It's garbage. Go back and try again. Before you know it, like you're doing 4 or 5 times of doing this. The staffer's pissed. The candidate thinks you're an idiot. And, nobody's done anything, and you've lost like 4 days. Whereas now, like that whole cycle is now compressed because you can then get something that is coherent, error-free, but maybe boring, but can be sort of amplified based upon who's working on it at that time. And I think that to a real extent, that's really where the AI from a generative standpoint is standing right now. It's not the solve for everything, and it's not the doomers, but it is this sort of interesting drafting board where you can then produce a lot more content quicker, which is sort of responsive to the book, and also helps level up some of your younger staffers because they won't be able to do the research that ChatGPT can do in 10 seconds with the information that you give them. If you give, for example, a first-year political operative like I was, every speech that the candidate has ever done, a pile of research, on the district and a couple of other things, you're still going to get back crap because I don't know what I'm doing yet. But instead, if you throw it all into ChatGPT, you get something that's coherent and okay. And then that person then is freed up to think, okay, well, this isn't that great, but I would tweak it this way, this way, and this way. And then you go and you have that conversation, and it is much richer, and you get to much better content quicker than you would have if you just say, to that poor kid who was me at one point, go fish.
Right. So it sounds like generative AI specifically has or holds a lot of promise for campaign managers. But thinking about that, then, what are the ethical considerations that campaign managers and consultants need to consider when using generative AI?
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, it all goes back to adult supervision. Okay. If you are allowing this stuff to basically draft whatever you're going to use, well, then the real ethical concern here, and this is like pulling back to a political science conversation, who's the candidate then? Is it ChatGPT or is it your person, right? So you need to make sure you need to ground all of whatever you pull there in the humanity of the candidate, in the humanity of what you're trying to accomplish, and to be aspirational. Campaigns are generally about the future, not about just bland information you can pick up from ChatGPT. So I would look at this as an information resource, not as something that is going to replace anybody on the campaign. This is a way to amplify the best parts of your campaign, not to replace them. And to be honest, the things that I'm actually really concerned about is really sort of the back ends of that chapter where I was talking about someone is working on currently a way to come up with a campaign plan for candidates who can't afford to even do a campaign plan. Well, to me, that's the threshold that I'm concerned about, because the campaign plan is where you decide strategically how you're going to take advantage of the moment, how your candidate is going to run, how you're going to run against other candidates, how you expect other people to be involved. And all of that is really high level thinking. And I'm sorry, I just don't buy the idea that within 2, 4, 6 years, we're going to get to the point where you can just outsource that to ChatGPT or something else. And also, I don't think you should. I think that campaigns are really about people. And the further you get away from that, I think that voters won't reward that, because I think that we're in a situation right now where everyone's striving for authenticity, right? That's the word. That's why we do podcasts, because we're actually having long form conversations. So you can get inside my head and, you can talk about what's important to you. And I think that candidates, when they get pushed far like that's when you learn the most, right? That's why Kamala Harris had such a hard time the first time running against Trump, because she was in these controlled situations because they didn't feel confident that she could execute there. And it's one of the reasons why Trump, for all his foibles, when he's on Joe Rogan for 3 hours and saying, some coherent stuff, some crazy stuff, like they're like, well, at least he's real, right? And so I think that real right now is what everyone is really striving for in politics. And this runs counter to that. And so the more that we give to AI and not take back is really the meta concern that I have about where AI can go in campaigns.
And you switched into political scientist mode there for a minute. I want to keep it there. What are some of the academic questions that you see as most pressing? What are the answers that we need from the scholarly literature most immediately?
So what I really want to see is I want to see some experimentation where you use something that's created by humans versus something that's created by AI and see, number one, does it turn people out? Number two, does it persuade? Like, to me, that is the central question right now is generative AI. Does it just pull people out, who you would already have? Or is it persuasive? And I think that, when we start seeing more and more of those academic tests, I think what we're going to find out is that the human created stuff is actually really good, but the AI stuff is probably better than we thought it was. And that's actually the biggest danger here from a political science standpoint, is that the experimentation may reveal that some of the human created content is simply not as good, or that we have something to learn from AI, which is how they put it together and the kinds of things that we have there. The other thing that I'm really concerned about, and this is more from political science, is the political polarization here. So is AI generated content pushing us basically to hard red, hard blue, or is it helping to thread the needle, which is where I land in the book, in the new permanent campaign, which I did write in the first time, but I think I wrote a better version of it this time. It always gets better, right? But in any case, my point of view is that I worry that this stuff would just be too easy to weaponize as opposed to thread needles in campaigns where you're trying to expand your coalition. Because from my perspective, I think for candidates that are in safe districts, even if they get past their primaries, there's still good business to be done by blowing out your opponent, right? I mean, wouldn't you rather have 65% of the vote instead of 51? Well, you would, because number one, no one's going to challenge you. But number two, then you can claim a wider coalition to either get stuff done or even move on to another race that's bigger. Because if you're going statewide, you're going to have to get a bigger coalition, right? And so from my perspective, I think, you can argue it on the politics and also in the political science that we need political science to really engage the efficacy of AI and how it works in campaigns, and not just be talking about disinformation versus, human-centered campaigns.
Yeah. So, switching to the permanent campaign, this idea that the campaign doesn't end on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. It carries on throughout that elected official's time in office, preparing them for re-election throughout that entire term. Thinking about that permanent campaign, I want to get your thoughts on what it means for kind of these big ticket ideas of American governance. So what does the permanent campaign mean for American democracy? What does it mean for representation? What does it mean for, as you were just talking about, polarization?
Well, I guess on the democracy side, it makes us more of a direct democracy than a republic. The founders really didn't want us to do this. This is running really counter to what the intent of our government is in the United States. We were supposed to, this is the way it was set up. We vote for people. They go and they do things. Then they come back and they ask for their vote again. We get to evaluate them based upon what they did. And so it gave those people freedom to make choices that, frankly, maybe some of them we don't agree with, because they were able to go off somewhere, whether it's at the state capitol or to Washington or whatever. It allowed people to sort of make these independent leadership choices. And so you had leaders who made hard choices. Sometimes they won, sometimes they lost. But now, because we know everything that's going on in Washington or in your state capital or in your county commission or wherever, you can follow it. And so you can engage in real time to try and move your representatives closer to what you want. Now, if you work in public affairs, well, that's the whole business, right? So there's an entire business around this. And I'm not saying that I don't work in it. I actually think it's good. But we've also lost something a little bit along the way. And that is the independence and brain power of our representatives, because we expect them to be just like us. And if not, we don't reward them. And so right now you have somebody who's running for re-election for Senate in Texas, who, for example, went after and tried to do something about immigration. Well, he was acting as a leader. You may not agree with it. And he has now drawn himself into a really tough primary because he has made certain choices that do not reflect his voters. And they know it. They know it because they have access to information. They have the way to also weigh in while he's doing it. And so instead of a John Cornyn, you may now get a Paxton, who is much more likely to be in tune with the electorate, but also less likely to think independently. And honestly, we actually need independent thought in the House and the Senate and all of our institutions to really help us move forward. And it also incentivizes them not to work together on big issues. So immigration is not going to get solved in the House or the Senate without bipartisan support. And you don't get that if you don't have John Cornyn's and others, who are willing to take risks. So that's where we are right now. I think it's really a difficult spot from a democracy standpoint. Now, from a professionalism standpoint, it's great because now you don't have to just build up your teams for election years and then fire half of them because you can't afford to keep them on board. You now have campaigns that are basically running, in between elections. And you also have public affairs organizations that are empowered to represent ideas and also represent people. Now, that's crossways with the way we set up the whole thing, right? And so I think we're in a situation now where you look at it and you're saying, okay, we're becoming much more of a direct democracy, but I don't know that that's always good for us, even though on certain issues, maybe it is. But on many issues that are really, really difficult and intractable and big and that require support cross-party, that's where we end up in a tough spot. And that's why we end up in situations where we don't have a clear answer to immigration. We don't have a clear answer to the debt. We don't have a clear answer to entitlement reform. And those things are really the hardest nuts to crack if you don't have a system that's built for inter-party friendships and inter-party working. And right now, that's really the problem with the permanent campaign. Permanent campaign is making it harder for us to get things done that are big, but it is also helping these people get reelected much easier.
All right. Dr. Cohen, if you could have the listeners walk away from this episode of The Politics Guys with just one or two critical takeaways about modern political campaigns, what would they be?
I think we'll go to the two audiences. So if you are a political science major, the one takeaway I want you to take with you is that you don't have to go to law school. You don't have to do it. If you want to be a lawyer, okay? But if you are on the fence and your parents are just saying, well, I'll pay for it, you need to reevaluate because there are things that you could do that would be really impactful and interesting and fun and engaging and different. And it's a really interesting path to be involved in politics. So I think what I'd like to be able to do is, if I can, save a few political scientists from being lawyers. Okay, that's the first thing. Especially the people who don't want to do it. The second thing that I would say is that for people who are interested in politics, that it is worth knowing how these things are built. It is worth knowing not only the intricacies of them, but the people that do it. And so for me, don't just get caught up in the D's versus R's, my team versus your team, or, God, they're always fighting. I'm going to throw my hands up and walk away from it. This is a really important piece of democracy, is how elections work and who the people are working on them and how they're built. Because then you can be a much critical evaluator of candidates and also understand what's happening in real time, as opposed to just letting it all wash over you and then getting to the last 2 weeks of the election and paying attention because you've been just so angry about the whole thing. Like, people working on both sides of the aisle work really, really hard on these campaigns. This is a lifestyle for a lot of people. It is something that people are passionate about. Like, this is not just like computer sales. This is not just, mowing lawns for a living. This is not just, this is something that people feel really super passionate about. Okay. And I want them to be able to not just understand it, but also respect it in a way that I think gets lost in a lot of the political commentary, where it's just built on arguments. It's built on failures. It's built on wins and losses. And so to me, I think that there's, go back to the word humanity. I think there's a lot of humanity in these campaigns that I think is worth knowing. And so I hope that they take that away from it too, that their democracy is really dynamic. It's changing all the time. And there is a push-pull between, professionalism, technology, and speed, and also the people behind all of this. And it's super interesting. I find that the closer you get to it, it's actually more interesting than you would think. And so I encourage people to read the book. I encourage people to get involved in politics, and I encourage political science students to think hard before they say yes to law school.
Well, Dr. Cohen, thank you for joining me today on The Politics Guys, and thank you for the opportunity to read your new book. I'm going to do a little teaser here. There's something in the book that I didn't talk to you about during the interview, but I want the readers to be aware of as they pick the book up. And it's a fun story about vampires and Stephen Colbert. So that's your teaser to go out and pick up this new book. Again, listeners, that was the CEO of Cohen Research Group, Johns Hopkins University professor and political scientist, Dr. Michael Cohen, on his new book, Modern Political Campaigns: How Professionalism, Speed, and Technology Have Revolutionized Elections. And it's available right now wherever you buy books. That ends this interview episode of The Politics Guys. If you're not a supporter of The Politics Guys, if you want to have more interviews with amazing authors like Dr. Cohen, you should become a supporter. Supporting the show gives you access to all kinds of benefits, like access to these episodes without any of the advertisements or any of the interruptions. But there's so much more to being a supporter of The Politics Guys. It includes being part of our very active Discord group and all kinds of other benefits. So if you want to support great interviews like this one on modern political campaigns, head on over to patreon.com/politicsguys right now. Take a look at the different levels of support and the different options you'll have to support the show, support the mission, and support the guys behind the podcast. Again, go to patreon.com/politicsguys, because shows like this are only possible with your support. If you'd like to support us in other ways, we're on Venmo at Politics Guys, and you can also support the show through PayPal. All of these support links are in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. If you want to buy the book, Modern Political Campaigns by Dr. Michael Cohen, you'll find a link to do so in those show notes. If you'd like to be any kind of member, but you just can't support us right now, we totally get it. We'd still love to have you share, subscribe, rate, and review this episode in whichever podcast app you use and on social media. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or anything else you'd like to ask us about the book, the interview, or anything else we do at The Politics Guys, please drop us a line at mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us on Facebook and X. You can find all of those links, you guessed it, right there in the show notes. I'd like to give a huge thank you to the executive producers of The Politics Guys, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marina, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. And of course, a special thank you goes out to you, our listeners. The other guys will be back with a full episode this weekend, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,